Hello, welcome back to our chapter by chapter summary through our study in the book of Genesis. We're normally doing this on Wednesday nights here at Aberdeen First Baptist in our midweek Bible study. But during COVID-19, this is how we're coming to you. So I hope you're continuing to read through the book of Genesis. We're going to be talking about in this session the contents of chapters 32 and 33. So we left off in the story where Jacob has now left after 20 years being in Haran with his uncle and father-in-law Laban, and he is now on his trek back to Canaan and the Promised Land. But you might say it's sort of been out of the frying pan and now into the fire, because now he knows that he is going to meet his brother Esau. And if you remember in the story, Jacob had stole the blessing along with conspiring with his mother from Esau. And Esau, the last thing he knew about him is he had vowed to kill him. So that is one reason he had fled and one reason he had been in exile for the last 20 years. But now he is going back to home and he is going to be meeting up with Esau. And we see Jacob do something here that's significant and different for him. We see him now praying to the Lord before this event happens. And we see him not seeking to be the trickster, not seeking to outmaneuver Esau once again, or to use his own cunning, but to actually trust in the Lord. And we see in the prayer there in chapter 32 that it's filled with humility. He understands that God has to be the one that's going to go before him and take care of this problem. We also see him expressing gratitude. He knows that he has worked for 20 years for Laban, but he also recognizes that ultimately it's God who has given him the blessings that he has, all of the provision, the wealth that he has left Haran with. He knows that is from the Lord. He's also praying that God will protect him from Esau. He knows, believes that Esau is going to do him harm, but he knows that God is the one that has to protect him. And it's very interesting that he reminds God of God's promises to him. Now, it's not as if God actually needs to be reminded. God hasn't forgot his promises, but in his praying, it shows us that Jacob is resting. He's recalling, he's depending on those promises. He knows that God has promised him the same promises he gave to his father and grandfather about the land, about the people, about being a great nation and blessing the world through him. And he knows that if he's dead because Esau kills him, that can't happen. So he reminds God of those promises and he rests on those promises. Now, he also plans. He plans to meet him. So he sends gifts ahead of him. He's already sent messengers ahead, and Esau has not really sent a specific word back. The servant comes back and just says, Esau's coming to meet you, and he's bringing 400 men with him. Well, Jacob assumes this in a negative way, that he's coming to do harm and to aggress, and it may be to just wipe him and all of his folks out. So he organizes these gifts, different droves, in other words, of animals that he's going to present to Esau to appease him. The text tells us that he gives him 220 goats, 220 rams, 60 camels, 50 cows, and 30 donkeys. And he sends each of those separately. So you got 5 different droves going with servants, each one coming to Esau ahead of time, presenting those on Jacob's behalf to make appeasement and to show humility. And then the most interesting thing happens. While all this is going on, during that night, before he meets Esau the next day, Jacob has sent all of his family and servants and livestock and goods ahead of himself just across the river Jabbok. And the river Jabbok was a stream that flowed from the east into the Jordan River, but Jacob is left alone that night. And the text tells us that he wrestles with a man through the night. It doesn't identify who this person is, but Jacob wrestles through the night. The text tells us that he prevails, that he is demanding a blessing from this person, but he won't let him go until he receives that blessing. And then the person he's wrestling says, well, what is your name? Well, Jacob says, well, my name is Jacob. He says, well, your name is no longer going to be Jacob. Your name is going to be Israel. And Israel means he or one who strives or struggles with God, a very fitting name for Jacob. And this is a significant point in the story because this is the name by which the people will become known, the nation of Israel. And it means those who struggle with God. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the identity of this wrestler. Who is this person? Is this simply an angel that has come, a messenger from the Lord who is a proxy for the Lord himself? Or is this a God himself? Jacob calls the place Peniel, which means the face of God. So Jacob has an awareness that he has met God in this wrestling match in some way, some fashion. Some believe this could even be a pre-incarnate appearing of Christ himself. I honestly don't think the text clearly tells us one way or the other how to understand exactly who this is. It is obviously the presence of God, either directly or indirectly through a messenger. So one is left with the question, well, how in the world could Jacob be strong enough to actually prevail against God himself or even against an angel, a messenger from God? And I like to think of it this way. I don't think Jacob was stronger. I think that it's a lot like when I used to wrestle with my son Justin when he was very little, and we wrestled a lot because he loved to do that. And you know, he would wrestle with me, and in that wrestling, I would pretend, I would act like he had me pinned down or that he knocked me down or something like that. But obviously, I was the stronger one in such a wrestling match. But I did it on his behalf and for his benefit. And I think this is what's going on here. So Jacob is reminded he's really not the stronger one because of what the Lord does to him. He dislocates his hip very easily, it would seem. But yet Jacob receives this blessing. He receives this change of name that becomes so significant. So the next day, chapter 33, we see the reunion that takes place. And it's an unexpected reunion. It's not what Jacob thought was going to happen. Jacob separates, for the worst case scenario, his group. We see him essentially ranking who's most important, least important to himself. And then he goes on ahead of a whole group to meet Esau. He shows great humility before Esau and respect, bowing, the text tells us many times. And they have a sweet reunion. They follow each other. They hug, they kiss, they embrace, they weep together. It's been 20 years since these brothers have seen each other, but it's a forgiving reunion on Esau's part. It's a joyful reunion. It's a loving one, and that's all on Esau. And we see that in the meantime, we don't know what's going on with Esau, but we do see that God has been gracious to him and has blessed him as well, because they enter into this haggling over the gifts. Esau doesn't want to receive the gifts that Jacob has given. Jacob insists that he takes it, and the going back and forth. You've probably done stuff like this in your family, who gets the check or whatever. But they go back and forth over this, and eventually Esau relents and does have to take the gifts. The end of the chapter, we see now that Jacob has re-entered the promised land. He's back in Canaan. The text tells us that he settles into Shechem, the city of Shechem, which is about 65 miles north of Jerusalem. And now we have him and all of his company, which is large now, back in the promised land. Jacob sets up an altar called El Elohe Israel, which means God of Israel. So we see him worshiping the one true God now that he's back in the land that God has promised. So what do we see in these two chapters? Well, a couple of things. We certainly see God revealing his character. God is keeping his promises. God is showing mercy to Jacob and his group, God is continuing to fulfill everything that he said he was going to do in his own timing, in his own way. But we also see God shaping Jacob's character. I think this is also just as important. He's been in exile in the wilderness, you might say, for 20 years. In that time, he's been learning patience. He's been learning humility. He's been learning how to trust God more, how to go to God now, and learning who God is and how God is guiding his life. And as his name reflects, he's also been wrestling. We see in Jacob a person who struggles. He struggles against God. He struggles against other people. But yet God is growing him in all of this. And don't miss this, because I think it's highly symbolic as well as literal for Jacob, is you don't go through that kind of struggling and striving and not walk away without a limp. God has taught him and humbled him in so many ways. And the same is true for us. We can listen to the Lord. We can be teachable. Or we can also learn some things the hard way. And anytime we want to decide to learn things the hard way, we want to strive with God as well. Don't be surprised if we don't walk away with a limp too. So continue reading on into Genesis. Next week, we'll be headed into the last chapters that tell us the Jacob story before we move on to the rest of the book, which focuses on Joseph. So until we're here again, keep reading, keep praying, and I'm so happy that you're joining us for these studies in Genesis.